Well, thank you guys for turning out on such a nasty morning. I was sitting in the hall. I was sitting home waiting for that email, right? For the MU alerts. Going, come on, Gene, call it, right? Because my wife works for the government, and she didn't have to go in until 2 hours late, and all this other schools. I thought sure it was going to be us too, but here we are. Not so bright-eyed and not so bushy-tailed. Friday or Thursday is your preliminary bibliography, right? We went over that assignment in class with some thoroughness. If you're having any trouble finding stuff, don't wait till Wednesday night, because I teach Wednesday nights as well, right? So I won't be able to help you sort of late Wednesday afternoon onward. So if you're having difficulty today, tomorrow is the time to come and see me, right? Or earlier in the day on Wednesday if you can. But I often have meetings, and I'm certainly happy to help. Remember that that's due in stages. You have a chance to revise it for the final grade, because people often have trouble with one or more aspects of that assignment, in particular the formatting issue, right? So it gives me an opportunity to make comments on that as well, and also comments about whether or not you've been duly diligent in looking for things like, hey, when I looked up Rembrandt, I found 500 entries. Why do you have this one on his drawings when you're working on a painting, right? Something like that. And then with the final one, I'll make more specific recommendations on things that I might know about that can be helpful to you. But you need to do the work first, right? So that's due on Thursday. I'll try to get it back to you by Monday, right, over the weekend. So you have plenty of time to work on the revision of that. Okay, we were talking about Renaissance art, and we were looking at works that were made for the Medici family. And something we've been talking about with the Renaissance since we really started class was the connection between this new, more realistic style and the changes in society, in particular the rise of this sort of merchant class of people, right? People who are participating in an early capitalist system where they're making their own status in the world. Whereas in the Middle Ages, right, your status was your birthright. So peasantry born to peasants, nobles born to nobles, right? And with the Renaissance, in the Renaissance era, it coincides with this idea that there are certain areas in Europe where you can actually change your status based on your financial success, right? And Florence is one of the major places where we see this. And so the Medici family are a terrific example of that, because they're bankers, right? They're really part of this new system. And in addition to that, what we're looking at here, as well as we talk about the revival of ancient Rome, which is what the word Renaissance means, right? We're also looking at a different issue, which is that when we looked at Giotto and Duccio, for example, all we really saw was realism. That was what they got when they looked back at ancient Rome, was a sort of more three-dimensional, realistic way of making art, right? But it didn't really look like Roman art. Now, with Donatello in the 15th century, we hit the second phase where he's not just looking at Roman art for realism, but he's actually adopting Roman body types, right? And we saw Masaccio doing the same thing in his paintings, adopting this contrapposto pose that came from studying ancient Roman statues or Roman copies of ancient Greek statues, right? So it's really kind of a second phase of the Renaissance, where the interest in ancient Roman art is now getting stronger. It's not just the realism that they're interested in. They're now also very much interested in Roman body types, right? And we'll see this morphs even further as we move on. So we left off talking about Donatello's David, which was commissioned for the Medici Palace, which we have on the screen a second ago, or we didn't last week. We did, and stood sort of right in the center of the entryway, right in the courtyard of the Medici Palace. And Donatello has gone back and has really spent some time not just looking, but really studying ancient Roman copies of Greek statues and picking up that contrapposto pose. And we know from his biographer, this guy Vasari, we've talked about a number of times, that Donatello was really very interested in this one sculptor in particular, Praxiteles, whose musculature was somewhat softer. And we'll see as we look at Donatello's David more closely that its musculature is also softer, kind of on purpose, right? And so with worksheet 4, we talked about other works by Donatello that had been done for different parts of this new capitalist structure in Florence, right? Working for the Linen Guild, linen drapers. They sort of gauged how good the linen was, right? And how St. Mark, the patron saint of that guild, wears what appears to be very credibly linen. That Donatello is so good with textures when it comes to sculpture. And also the fall of light on his face, that his expression almost seems to change as the light changes on his face. And here he's fiddling with the linen, right? We see that same contrapposto pose in both of them. But how different, how much more sort of burly and muscular, fierce the St. Mark is rather than the David who's kind of dainty and aloof. Right? Donatello's really a great chameleon in style. And in the ability to take the materials, right, that he's working with, whether it's marble or cast bronze, which we talked about. Take that material and make it seem like something else. So make the marble seem like skin or hair or linen. Or to make bronze, which is hard and cold, right, look like skin, which is soft and warm, right? And he's really terrific in his ability to transform materials, right? So with the St. Mark, right, there's a close-up of the linen, and we can see the sort of optical ability to sort of make one material seem like another. And that's true with the David as well. And for the David, it's kind of an important element of this issue, of how the sculpture is meant to work. Because David, if you know the story, he's a kid, right? He's the boy king. He's in his early teens when he slays Goliath, right? And so for Donatello, what he wants to do is to make David appear weak. Because it's not David through his own strength that slays Goliath. Could you please put your phone away? Thank you. It's not David through his own strength who slays Goliath, right? It's David through the strength of God, right? It's God's strength that does it. He's just a vehicle. And that's a theme that Donatello wants to sort of get across, is that this is somebody who couldn't do this on his own. And so he makes him look prepubescent, right? He's got muscles, but they're ill-formed, right? He's got man boobs, you know, really soft tummy, right? He's not an athlete yet, but rather he is this child, right? Adolescent, who's relying on the strength of God to do this. And that's a theme that Donatello picks up in this sculpture in various little details that add to that meaning, right? So, for example, we see him from the back, and remember, he's freestanding. We can walk around him. We can see the softness of his skin and the sort of almost androgynous nature of his body, that it looks so not entirely masculine everywhere, right? And that's one of Donatello's points of doing that, you know, is not without reason. It's to point out the fact that this is David the boy king. This is David who needs the strength of God in order to accomplish this feat of defeating the giant Goliath, right? How else can you possibly kill one? And his soft flesh is part of that, right? The sort of vulnerable soft flesh. And so is the nudity, right? I mean, he's not marching off into battle looking like this in reality, in the Bible story, right? But why is he naked? Well, he's naked because he's not relying on armaments. He's not relying on his own physical attributes. He's relying on the supernatural intervention of God in order to get this done. So the nudity adds to that meaning as well, right? And with the nudity, we've got this detail that I didn't notice for the first 20 years or so I taught art history. Goliath's helmet is at his feet, and there's a feather in the helmet, and the feather goes way up there, right? Tickling the inside of the soft inner side of his thigh. And that adds to this theme of the softness of his flesh. You're aware of sort of soft touch, soft flesh everywhere you look. And it adds to this idea that Donatello's David is incapable of doing this on his own, right? He's a soft, prepubescent boy. And it sounds quite homoerotic, and it kind of is, right? In the same way, he's sort of physically or mentally unprepared for this as well, right? Just in the same way that he's sort of ill-formed physically to do the task at hand. We also see that there's something about his face, and you can see now that when it comes out of the mold, you've got to sort of finish the skin, and you scrape it, and you treat it with chemicals, and you can see some of the scraping on the bronze, and some of the pitting where the casting didn't quite work as well, right? But the look on his face is like unaware of what he's doing. And yet he's standing on the decapitated head of somebody, right? He's just done this. And yet the look on his face is not some sort of fierce scowl, some giant killer decapitator, huge men, right? Right? He's got a look on his face that doesn't seem as if he's really aware of what's going on around him. He's aloof, right? And it's that idea, as well as the idea of the soft touch, right, is picked up if you look closely at the detail of his foot on the head of Goliath. So imagine the story, right? That's the bloody stump of his neck, right? And you have to imagine, with the realism, the blood is in the beard and all. And what is he doing with his foot? He's got his toe. He's sort of like twirling that sticky, blood-mottled beard around his toes, which is really disgusting in a way, right? But it adds to this idea of the gentle touch that's everywhere. Yep. And Donatello loves fidgeting. Right? The St. Mark is fidgeting with his robe. And David is fidgeting. And that gives them a sense of sort of inner vitality, inner life that's there. But there are all these elements throughout that pick up the idea of touch. Right? And that for Donatello with the David is a way of driving home this idea that he's the giant killer who relies on the strength of God. He can simply not do it himself. Now, about the patronage of this. This was commissioned by the Medici family. Donatello had already done a statue of David for the city of Florence. So this is a much earlier version, right? In marble, also with the head of Goliath at his feet. And he originally had a leather strap that attached the stone at the bottom to his hand, right? So it was kind of a more active moment rather than just holding the rock off to the side, right? And this stood before the city hall in Florence, or within, we're not 100% sure, but it was commissioned by the city of Florence, the original David, right, before the Medici family commissioned theirs. And the reason the city of Florence commissioned this work was because that they saw themselves as David. And this goes to the history of Florence, which they had a lot of enemies. They were enemies with Siena, where Duccio lived. They were enemies with the Duke of Milan, right? And they were always marching into battle against these enemies who were stronger than they were. And they'd come out victorious. So they saw David's battle against Goliath as an analogy to their success in battle in the 15th century. And even though the patron saint of Florence was John the Baptist, they took David as their symbol. Right? Florence is David. We defeat stronger enemies against all odds, right? And the Medici, when they commissioned this, know that symbolism, right? They know that David stands for Florence. And by commissioning this for their palace, they're co-opting that symbolism. They're saying that the Medici family is David. And this is exactly at the same time that the Medici family is really controlling Florence. But the statue is behind closed doors, right? It's behind the walls of their palace. Only their friends get to see it. And it ends up proclaiming to them all the role the Medici family is playing in Renaissance Florence, which is the leaders behind the scenes of Florence itself. So just as David equals Florence, David equals the Medici. Therefore, the Medici equal Florence, right? Transitive property from geometry, right? A equals B and B equals C and A equals C, right? And that's what's going on with them. The reason they want the David in the first place is as a metaphor for their strength and power in Florence. And this was understood by their friends, right? By their allies in Florence. And we find a number of other families commissioning images of David. Now, they could be doing it out of public duty, seeing themselves as good citizens of Florence. But the Martelli family, who were close allies of the Medici, commissioned this David by one of the Rossellino brothers, right? And very much close to Donatello's two versions of it, right? He's got the sling down, but the pose and the hand on the hip are very similar to the Medici version. And when other families commission these sorts of things, they could either be saying that they're good Florentines, but more likely what they're saying is that they're good allies of the Medici family, that they're picking up that metaphor as well. So when we look at these works, we can talk about them in a number of different ways, right? We can talk about them as symbols of the revival of an interest in ancient Rome. Or we can talk about them certainly as religious works. But we can also talk about them as sort of social symbolism or political symbolism intended by the patrons who paid for these works in the first place. Remembering that neither Donatello nor the Rossellino brothers are making anything unless someone pays them up front, right? And once you pay for something up front, you get to call the shots. And in this case, those shots are what do I want and why do I want it, right? So these works have a really strong sort of political allegory. And Michelangelo's David, which you know, right, was also commissioned by the city of Florence later, after the Medici had gotten kicked out of Florence once and for all, right? And they're re-co-opting their symbol. We'll look at him next week, or later this week. But we have, as we look at Florentine art from Florence, we have quite a few examples of images of David. And we have a really interesting thing down at the National Gallery, which is a shield. This is a wooden shield that would be meant to be carried in a parade. So there are straps on the back, and you can see on the front even the places where the straps attach to the bumps right there. The other ones are sort of obscured down below. But there was, on the back was a leather strap that you could hold it in front of you like a piece of armament, right? A shield in front of you. But it's painted, covered with leather, and then the leather is painted with the image of David. And David makes a great thing to march into battle with, right? Because he defeats his stronger enemies, and so here I am, right? But why would you pay for a painter to decorate a shield that you're going to march into battle with? That doesn't make any sense, right? Because the whole point is to deflect somebody's sword, and all of a sudden your picture gets cut up. So what this one was commissioned for was for parades, right? Wearing military costume in parades. And we don't know by whom. We do know that the majority of shields that were decorated for parade use had the coat of arms of the family who commissioned it. Could this be a Medici work? We don't know. Right? Maybe, maybe not. There are lots of inventories of the stuff they owned, and this wasn't in it. Could it be someone else who's just a loyal Florentine? Could it be someone else who's a friend of the Medici family and sort of showing off that idea? These are all possibilities with the image of David on this leather shield, this leather and wooden shield meant to be carried. So here we see it from the front, right, rather than from the raking side. And you get the sense now of that sort of three-dimensional. There's the other bolt, right, that holds the leather strap on the back. And David looking off, he's killed Goliath, he's calling to his troops, still got the sling, even though Goliath's head's got one right there. And the placement of the head and his feet is this common Donatello thing, right, that Castagno is picking up as well. Again, as a Renaissance work, it's not only interested in realism in the 15th century, but it's also very much interested in ancient Roman art. And he's borrowed from a well-known Roman statue to make this image of David with the head of Goliath. So we've been tracing quite a few works that were commissioned by the Medici or by people associated with them through the course of the 15th century, because the Medici are the ostensible leaders of Florence, even though they were never elected, right? They were working behind the scenes, getting their people into office. Now, Cosimo de' Medici was the first of the family that became a major art patron around 1430 or so, right? But his son and his grandson were also prominent art patrons. And the family had a legacy going through the rest of the 15th century as major patrons of the arts. And many of the works that are best known from this period come from the Medici circle, right? So the famous Birth of Venus that we looked at very briefly a week ago, right, was made for Cosimo de' Medici's grandson, named Lorenzo de' Medici. Right? And he commissioned it as a decoration for a wedding of his cousin, whose name was also Lorenzo. It just gets confusing, right? Lorenzo commissions this for the wedding of his cousin. And we know that for a couple of different reasons. One is that it's painted on canvas. Now, most paintings up to this point were done on wooden panels. And in the 15th century, paintings on canvas were not meant to be permanent. They were meant to be rolled up and laid out for a particular event, right? And it's a fairly simplified composition as well. The background, even though it does go deep into space, really ends up being this plane of green and a plane of blue with four figures that are prominent, as if sort of a wall decoration, a mural decoration. It's flatter than a lot of works are. And these things add up to make us think that there was a decoration for a wedding. And we add to that the fact that the birth of Venus, the goddess of love, right? The birth of the goddess of love. What a great theme, right? For a wedding. Right? It's the birth of the goddess of love, the birth of love. So all of these things together add to our knowledge that this was in fact a wedding decoration, right, from this time. Yet it remains to this day one of the most famous Renaissance works. It was never intended to be a sort of a permanent work. Right? Kind of like the Eiffel Tower. You know that the Eiffel Tower was built to be a demonstration piece, right? It's supposed to be torn down almost immediately as soon as it was done in 1889. And now it's like the symbol of Paris, right? But again, it was not intended to be anything more than a temporary work. So we get lucky that way sometimes, right? So again, ongoing Medici patronage. Sandro Botticelli was one of their favorite artists. Did numerous works for the Medici family. We'd already seen early in his career, he had done this Madonna and Child for the Medici family with their coat of arms on the throne in the foreground. Right? And now they're still calling on him 15 plus years later as one of their favorite artists for making works of art for various locations. Right? So Botticelli, long-standing Medici artist, favorite artist. And here's Venus coming to shore on that clamshell, partially covering her nudity, but not so well. Intended to be a paragon of extraordinary beauty, right? An example of absolutely amazing beauty. And the figure, Botticelli bases the pose on a statue that the Medici family owned. This is a statue of Venus that was in the Medici collection. It goes back to the 2nd century AD. It's an old Roman statue, right? And a copy of a 4th century BC Greek work. But it becomes the basis for the Venus figure that we see, which is perfect for the Medici, right? Because again, it's for a wedding from a member of their family, right? So he's adopting it for that particular reason. It's often called the modest Venus type because she is sort of covering up, or at least partially covering up, the naughty parts, right? Now, the legend of the birth of Venus is that she was born miraculously from the sea. And the way that she was born was that there was a god whose genitals were cut off, and they fell into the ocean, right? And that gave rise to Venus. We talked about that, didn't we? When we talked about her connection with the Virgin Mary, right? Yeah. So after that, she's then blown to shore by figures that embody natural phenomena, right? So up in the sky on the left, we have embodiments, manifestations of the winds blowing her to shore. Okay? And that's a standard Roman thing, is to give human form to natural phenomena. Right? So rather than just trying to show wind, which, I mean, how do you paint wind, right? Difficult thing in itself. They'd instead give it human form. So the two figures embracing as they come in from the left are intended to be the winds that are blowing Venus gently to shore on this conch shell. And we can see the cheeks distended, right, as they're blowing. And then you begin to notice that there are flowers everywhere, right, floating through the sky. And Venus is gently being blown sort of from left to right to the shore. And she's being welcomed by the figure on the right, who's about to put a robe on her. You can see this sort of gold collar on the robe, which is itself decorated with more flowers, as is that figure. We think she's meant to be springtime, right? And that this brings in multiple ideas that wrap up together with this. Is that springtime welcomes her, right? Because when the goddess of love arrives, right, rebirth happens, and spring is rebirth, right? So there's this connection being drawn between the seasons of the year, right? The cycle of the seasons coming out of the winter and into the spring, and the arrival of love, right, being related to that.
Are the two people that are blowing are representing angels?
No, not at all. I think, well, they might be a connection that would be grown. This is a good question. They're not directly, in the same way that she's not directly the Virgin Mary, right? But the connection between them would have been something that people might have teased out, right? And I'd have to look into that further to see whether or not people made those connections, because we have writings from them, right? So when I say that people looked at Venus and saw an analogy, a symbol for the Virgin Mary, right? Saw connections. I can point to evidence, right? And I can point to poetry that people wrote that talked about the connections between them and whatnot. So I'd have to look further to find out if. That's right. If Zephyr that's who he is, right? He's one of the gods. I forget who she is.
Also, they're gods.
Gods, well, they're personification. Zephyr. I have to look again. That's not. I have to look further. But the thing that. Okay, I'll try to do this as briefly as possible to make it direct. But the thing that we do see for angels is Cupid, right? And Cupid's got a bunch of henchmen, all who look like Cupid, and they're babies, right? And they've got wings. And so adults with wings are more difficult, although we talked about, it makes some sense. It really does, because if you think about this as the birth of Venus, we go back and we think about the Annunciation, right? And there's the angel coming in with wings from the left, and there she is waiting for them. It's a really good connection. I hadn't really thought that one through so much, right? Because they always think angels go back to what the Romans call putti, or puto singular, right? Which are these little friends of Cupid, the rotis, right? They're erotic figures that do what Cupid wants them to, make, sharpen their arrows and make us all fall in love and all of that, right? I think that's a good point, right? This way. And certainly with the flowers involved and everything else, right? That does seem like there's a really strong parallel there, right? So springtime welcomes her, right? She's got these wonderful flowers that she's going to clothe her with flowers, or she's going to cover her up, make it a little bit less R-rated, I guess, if you will, as she's coming forward here, right? Now, this interest that we're seeing with this work in one of the things we're seeing here that we haven't seen yet, right? Earlier today, we talked about the fact that in the earliest part of the Renaissance, they're looking back in ancient Rome, and all they're really getting from it, Giotto, right, is realism, right? A sense of three-dimensionality, chiaroscuro, right? And then in the early 15th century, we see them looking back in ancient Rome still, and they start to pick up other stuff. They start to pick up Roman body types, right? Donatello's David, Donatello's St. Mark, Masaccio's tribute money, right? These things pick up Roman body types, but they throw them into a Christian context, right? Still Christian subject matter. With this one, we have Roman subject matter, right? So our immersion in a revival of Rome is getting stronger. stronger and stronger and stronger through the course of the Renaissance. And we move from simple realism, and we add to that realism plus body types. Then we add to that realism plus body types plus subject matter. Right? As we are becoming increasingly interested in the Renaissance through the course of the century. So by the end of the 15th century, we've hit this point where it's kind of okay to do images of pagan scenes, right? Non-Christian scenes. But as we're talking, that doesn't mean they didn't draw a connection, right, to Christian ideas. And that's what, like I said, we've already talked about this before. Now, the principal group, philosophical group that did this, was a group that were known as the Neoplatonists, the new followers of Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher from the 5th century BC. Neoplatonic thinking. And this transcended philosophy to become sort of poetry and a way of thinking. And it was the Neoplatonists who drew the connection between Venus and the Virgin Mary. And the sorts of analogies that you were just asking, right? About whether or not we can look at Zephyr as the angel. And I think that, yeah, that would, and it becomes a sort of elitist mind game sort of thing. Like, I can find something that you can't, right? I can find a connection here. Oh yeah, we say, what about this, right? And not only did they make connections between Roman mythology and Christianity, but they would also find connections between other religions, right? They would look into Zoroastrianism and they would find connections, you know? Because these things, as the Renaissance has brought about a revival of learning, right? And they're going in and they're finding these things and they're sort of seeing how they all sort of fit together. And they're finding parallels in the different stories, saying, okay, well, there's this connection. And then one of the things that Neoplatonists would also mention is that the legend of the birth of Venus, not only is it a relationship to the Virgin Mary, love coming, but as I said, that's springtime coming, right? But then there's this other idea that Venus, born miraculously from a melding of God and matter, right? God and the earth. That could be seen as an analogy for something even deeper. The idea that beauty is a concept that's born in the mind of man. And is born through divine inspiration. Right? And that the birth of Venus from the ocean, from the castrated genitalia of Uranus, right, can be seen as an analogy for how we miraculously come up with these ideas about beauty. That it's through the fire of the gods, it's through the inspiration of the gods that we understand and create beauty. Right? So the analogies that they draw are not just inter-religious, right? They're sort of bigger ideas about what it means to be human, right? What it means to create, what it means to do our daily duties. And we know that there was a huge connection between this and the Medici family because Lorenzo de' Medici hosted an academy that met at the Palazzo Medici, a Neoplatonic academy, Oprah's book club, right? They would get together and they would discuss these things. And there was a leader who was one of the most prominent Neoplatonic thinkers who would lead these discussions at the Medici Palace, right? So the ideas that I'm talking about here may seem esoteric to you and me in the 21st century, right? But these are ideas that were at the core of how people were thinking in and around the Medici, right? And one of these people was little Michelangelo, right? He was hanging out at the Palazzo Medici in the 1480s. And when we get to him on Thursday, we're going to find that his ideas are like infilled with this Neoplatonic thinking, right? That takes on numerous, I mean, it would take an entire, upper division semester long class to even begin to scratch the surface of this. Right? Here in the intro, just realize it's out there as a way of thinking, right? So the connections that we're drawing between these doesn't stop here. Right? The connections that the Neoplatonists would draw would also extend to more esoteric ideas about how we think, right? How we understand our world, right? So this third period that we're talking about, where we're finally getting to Roman subject matter, historians usually call the High Renaissance, okay? So, the Proto-Renaissance is Giotto's area. We're sort of getting started. The early Renaissance, things are starting to come together with Masaccio and Donatello, right? The High Renaissance is where it all comes to fruition, where, you're working on a car and you're finally firing on all 8 cylinders. It's working, right? And everything's clicking, right? And it's the period of the greatest Renaissance artists, of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael, right? Where we see these ideas really come together and distill. And Botticelli's sort of at the beginning of that, right? And he, in fact, is a exact contemporary, there we go, of Leonardo, right? So Leonardo da Vinci, first minor thing, right? Da Vinci doesn't mean anything. It means he's from the town of Vinci, right? And what it tells us is that, something we know about him, he was a bastard child, right? I'm sorry that's pixelated. Let me see if I can get that reset so we get these bits of the previous slide no longer there. That's better. So he was born in Vinci. He was born out of wedlock, right? Moved as unclaimed, not really orphan, but unclaimed bastard child to Florence, and he's known as, because he can't take his father's name, right? Leonardo of Vinci, da Vinci, right? And that's why historically the best way to refer to him is by his first name. We get to be first name basis, right? Leonardo, because da Vinci just means the town he's from, right? It'd be like calling me of Arlington, or something like that, right? Rather than if I'd lost my name somehow. So keep in mind, all you Dan Brown fans, right? The Da Vinci Code. Nobody who knows anything about Leonardo calls him Da Vinci, right? That's not really his last name. So he moves to Florence to study art. He ends up apprenticing in the studio of a sculptor at exactly the painter at exactly the same time as Botticelli, right? So they are contemporaries. This is not, by the way, Fra Filippo Lippi. After Lippi, Botticelli went to a second apprenticeship master, and that's pretty common. Leonardo's there at the same time. They're working elbow to elbow as teenagers in an art studio, right? So they're both part of this new high Renaissance, but of course Leonardo, by far the better known of the two, right? We have got at the National Gallery the only universally accepted Leonardo painting anywhere in the Americas, right? There's a couple other ones that are up for grabs, not that good. This one's pretty great, and everybody, with no doubt, even though it's not signed, that it's by Leonardo. It's a very early work by Leonardo. Pretty much as soon as he got out of his apprenticeship, as soon as he went out on his own, this is one of his first works, right? And it's a portrait of a young woman in Florence, probably at the time of her wedding. Yeah.
If it's not signed,
How are we so sure it's his? That's a big. You keep asking questions. This is great that you ask these questions, but they always lead to long answers. How do we know? Circumstantial evidence, but it's really a lot of it. Okay? And 2 or 3 things. One, inventories from the period that list not only who made it, but who owned it and who made it. That helps a lot, right? And that helps nail this down. Then there's this thing that art history has relied on for centuries prior to the late 20th century, and that's what's called connoisseurship. Right? A connoisseur can just by eye determine qualities, one versus the other, right? So if you look at enough things, then you can immediately recognize things. In the same way that we as people are connoisseurs of our friends. So you're walking down the street and you see somebody up ahead and you know who it So connoisseurship also adds. Now, more recently, technical. Right? We can go in and look at how, with the ones that are really well documented, how they lay down the paint, right? And we can do samples of that, and we can find out if the wood is from the right time, if the paint is from the right time, if the paint is laid down in the way that artist tends to work, do comparisons of other works. The interesting thing about a signature is not always proof. Because who's to say somebody didn't add that signature later, right? Now, prior to this, prior to the 1470s or so, very few artists actually signed their works, right? We saw that Duccio signed the bottom of the Maestro. And we saw that Jan van Eyck signed the Arnolfini Wedding, right, from your worksheet. Those are rare, right? Roger van der Weyden, the deposition, didn't sign a thing, right? Robert Campan, that Annunciation pen, never signed a thing. We know from other records and from this other sort of circumstantial evidence that all points one direction. Who they were done by, there's still some debate with some of them, right? With this one, there isn't. It's just, I could, if I went through and showed you other Leonardos from the 1470s, okay, that one's right? But we can look back through records and we can find other ones that were wrongly attributed. Right? But signatures are rare at this point, because we're still breaking free from that idea of the artist as a craftsman, right? That old medieval idea, you belong to a guild and you're a craftsman and you just make something, you're making really nice objects rather than art with a capital A, right? And so we're still sort of breaking free from that. And the High Renaissance is kind of where that breaking free really takes hold. Okay? So, longish answer, right? Ginevra de' Benci, a young woman in Florence, reputed at the time to be the most beautiful woman in town. Whether or not that was true is impossible to tell. The panel you see is mostly square. Originally, it was longer, and we know this going back to technical studies, right? We can look at the panel, it's on panel, and we look at the panel it's painted on. We know that we have the edge that was left unpainted around the top and the sides, but not on the bottom. It's been cut off on the bottom. And originally, it was longer, and we think, based on other portraits by Leonardo at the time, that its original proportions were more like that, right? With the hands down below, because that was the norm for portraits at the time. And there's a drawing that we think probably goes with this. And again, the logic is way too complicated to get into. That may well have been a preparatory drawing for the hands of Ginevra de' Benci. But no smoking gun. We can't say for sure. But we do know that Leonardo loved having hands as part of the portraits because they added to the characterization of the individual in the portrait. Now, how do we know it's Leonardo? We'll come back. This is where we get there, right? Because one of the things that Leonardo did as he painted, and this is true throughout his entire career, is he loved obscuring things in darkness and haze. He loved painting in a way that you didn't see distinctions between where one thing ended and another thing began. Right? So transition points stopped sort of being a hard line and stopped being something softer and fuzzier where you can't really see. So in the background behind her shoulder, we can see these trees on the side of the hill, right? And it comes down to the water. And if we look at the shadow of the trees and we look at the transition from the tree to the bank to the water, or even behind that, as the river kind of goes around the corner there, right? The actual distinction points between things are utterly blurred. And that's something that Leonardo does all the time, right? And really well, right? Is that sort of smoky light, right? That haziness that obscures things. And in fact, he wrote about it, right? Leonardo, the thing about Leonardo that we have for the first time in the artist that we're talking about is he wrote extensively about art. And he wrote it for himself, right? He just kept notebooks and notebooks about his ideas. And he'd make sketches in them, but he'd also write in them. And he was left-handed, so he wrote backwards. Because if you're left-handed and you're using a fountain pen, right, a dip pen, you smear everything you write if you write left to right, because the heel of your hand is right where you just written. So he just wrote everything in mirror. So, because he wasn't trying to hide anything, right? They were for him. And it has all these notes about it. He talks about sfumato lighting, smoky light. Sfumato means smoky light. And how he was using it to obscure things. And the point of obscuring it is that part of the painting exists in your mind rather than on the panel. So in other words, as you look at this, and you look back there and you understand sort of how the landscape works, and you can put it all together in your head. But he's not delineating it. He's not inscribing those transitions. So where they seem to exist is a sort of a mental projection on the part of the viewer. Right? In other words, the picture is completed not by Leonardo. The picture is completed by the viewer who looks at it. Because you start to figure out those delineations and assume where they are. And he hasn't spelled it out for you. So there's this engaging sort of interaction between the work of art and you, the viewer. And this goes back to Neoplatonism. Okay? The Neoplatonic thinkers were all writing about the fact that the only place that true beauty and true perfection exists is in the mind of man. That true perfection does not exist in this world. Right? True perfection exists in the idea. And this is kind of the core of how even Plato, back in the 4th century, 5th century BC, that's how he wrote about the world. That the things that we see around us are sort of pale reflections of a perfection that we imagine. Right? Truth, ultimate truth, is a mental concept. That it doesn't work in the real world. That doesn't mean we shouldn't look for it, but we shouldn't look for it in examples in the physical world around us. We should look for it in the mind of man. Leonardo's pictures fall into this Platonic, Neoplatonic idea that the final resolution of his image only exists in your mind. Right? The final completion of his image only exists in the mind of the viewer. Now this becomes even more fascinating because one of the things we know about Leonardo is he had trouble finishing things. There are 4 or 5 major projects that he just abandoned halfway through. Never finished it. And for him, why bother? Right? Because the perfection's here. And once he gets the idea, he starts to map it out. Finishing it's going to ruin it. Right? Finishing is going to make it less perfect. In the same way that resolving the image down to the smallest Van Eyck-like detail, right, would have ruined it for him. Because now part of it still resides upstairs in our minds. And this idea of things kind of coming into and falling back into shadow through this sfumato, as if it's becoming in front of our eyes, is something we see everywhere in this work, right? So these wonderful curls of her hair that just sort of seem to emerge. You have to ignore the sort of reflection of my camera, right? But the way the curls seem to sort of disappear and reappear, everything's kind of in the state of becoming. This is something we see, and going back to your question, right? That's everywhere, right? Everywhere, these sort of rivulets, right? It almost looks like waves of water swirling, right? It's something that we see all over his works, right? So again, this is Neoplatonists talk about the fact that this idea that you leaving something incomplete, right, is actually a virtue for artwork. Don't think about this when you're writing a tribute. But for artwork, it's a virtue in that your mind completes it, and therefore it's more perfect than if it were actually complete. And Leonardo uses this sfumato lighting to get us there. So everywhere we look at the face of Ginevra da Benci, where is the edge of her headdress? Where is the edge of the hair on the right? she seems to emerge from that bush behind her, right? And we can't tell sort of where she stops and the bush starts. And that's typical for Leonardo's works, right? The interesting thing is that the bush is a juniper bush, right? Juniper berries, what you make gin from. And lo and behold, Ginevra is Italian for juniper. So he's added this bush that she seems to be emerging from and merging with as a symbol for her name. She's part of nature in a way. And again, these are themes that he reiterates throughout his entire career. This idea of having things emerge from nature, right? And be associated with nature is something he does again and again. Now, it was painted on both sides, and this gives us some clue as to who paid for it and what its original use was. So we know who she is from records, right, of ownership and whatnot, Ginevra de' Benci. We know that she was married right around this time. We also know that she had this friend who was a diplomat from Venice named Pietro Bembo. Right, I'll put his name here in a second. And he paid for the picture. This is the back side of the image, right? It's painted on both sides. And that's an old collector's mark, that wax bit in the upper right corner, like the seal on a letter, right? That's not original to the panel. But we can see it's damaged at the bottom. It may have had a candle in front of it or above a fireplace that caused that damage. We don't know for sure, right? But that accounts for why it was cut down at the bottom. And we have, her symbol, the juniper sprig in the middle. On the left, bay leaves, and on the right, palm frond. Those are the coats of arms of Pietro Bembo. And this motto that appears elsewhere in his work, beauty adorns virtue, in Latin, right? Beauty adorns virtue. And this motto is now applied to her. And it goes to a Renaissance way of thinking about outward beauty. That outward beauty is a reflection of inward virtue. That the beautiful in this world are virtuous, right? They're beautiful because they're virtuous. I don't think we really think that so much anymore, right? That the beautiful people are more virtuous, but nonetheless, it was believed in the Renaissance that if you led a virtuous life, you would become more physically beautiful on the outside as well. Right? And therefore, virtue, right, is adorned by beauty. And that's a motto that relates to her. This was a gift from her friend at her wedding, probably to her husband, right? And they were very, very close. They wrote poems for each other. They were not in love, per se. Right? And like I said, his name was Pietro Bembo, a major art collector and a diplomat from the city of Venice, visiting Florence right around for her wedding. In 1482, Leonardo leaves Florence. Okay, he comes to Florence as a bastard child, stays there for about 10 years active or so. 1482, he leaves Florence and he moves to the city of Milan in northern Italy. And he goes there to become the court painter to the Duke of Milan. Now, the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, has advertised this job, right? He wants somebody to come and work as his court painter. We've seen other court painters, like Jan van Eyck, right? Court painter to Philip the Good. Klaus Schluter, court artist to Philip the Bold, right? And it's a good gig. You live at court, right? You get an annual stipend. You get extra money when you're working, right? And your job is to serve their needs, whatever they want in the way of public art. And Ludovico's looking for a court artist. Sort of the word gets around. They didn't have Craigslist, but the word gets around. Leonardo applies for the job, and we actually have the letter, his job application letter, from Leonardo to Ludovico Sforza. And he writes to him, he says, I would love to come and work at your court. Here's what I can do. He says, I'm an engineer, a structural engineer. Right? I'm an architect. And building. Right? I can design sculptures. Right? I can design armaments for your military. I can help you divert rivers, right, for irrigation, etc., etc. I'm a poet. Oh, and by the way, I'm a painter, he says at the end, a sort of false humility, right? And he gets the job. And he goes to work for Ludovico Sforza in Milan, and the work on your right, which is in the Louvre in Paris, is a huge work, about 6 feet tall, that was done for a brotherhood that Ludovico Sforza belonged to, right? A religious brotherhood, a prayer group, right? And one of the things that Leonardo does, working as the court painter, is to paint this, right? The Madonna of the Rocks. And it's an image of the Virgin Mary in the center, with an angel on the right, John the Baptist and Jesus, two infants below her, in this sort of grotto, right? It's like a cave that opens up to this extraordinary misty background. Now notice as we begin to look, and I have details to show you, how much that sfumato lighting is still here. How the image of the Virgin Mary seems to meld back into the shadows. How the angel on the right melds into the shadows, so you can only barely see the wing. Right? You get a hint of the light at the top of the wing, as the rest of it almost melds with the rocks that are behind it. How we look through the opening to the distant landscape, and we see those extraordinary vertical rocks in this misty atmosphere. Leonardo's smoky light is everywhere to be seen. And for Leonardo, this is kind of an important element in this particular work, because he's using it to amplify the meaning of the work. The brotherhood, the religious brotherhood that Sforza belonged to, was dedicated to a particular aspect of the Virgin Mary's character. We talked about this before, in a way, right? Remember that the crossbowmen in Leuven that Roger van der Weyden worked for with that deposition were dedicated to the Virgin of Sorrows, a particular aspect of her character. Not just the Virgin, but the Virgin of Sorrows, right? Well, this group was dedicated to the idea that the Virgin Mary was herself born from a virgin. Right? The idea of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. And it goes back to the theological idea that in order for Mary to give birth to Jesus, who's born without sin, Mary had to be born without sin as well. So, extra biblically, right, the story rose up that the Virgin Mary, her mother, right, Anna, was also visited by an angel in the same way that the Virgin Mary would be. And that her pregnancy with Christ was also the result of miraculous intervention, the Immaculate Conception. And that's the theme that Leonardo is going to work with the Madonna of the Rocks. Okay? Now, Leonardo's got this thing, we know this from his writings. Even though he makes these pictures where you have to complete it in your mind, he doesn't like painting things that he can't see. He's a keen observer of the world, and then he translates those observations into these pictures. And he's a very close observer. He's something of a scientist. He wasn't really lying to the Duke of Milan. He studies geology. He studies water. Right? And he's very interested in these things. He's something of a proto-scientist almost, even though he's not using scientific method. Right? And so he's a keen observer of the world around him. He's keenly interested in the particulars of things. And he, for example, he talks about he hates drawing halos. You notice there aren't any, right? No halo on the Virgin Mary or on Christ or the Baptist, right? Because you can't see them. They're not in this world. So he doesn't like drawing them. So how does Leonardo then approach this painting that the subject matter is the miraculous birth of the Virgin Mary? How do you do that if you're an artist who's dedicated to seeing the world around you? What he does is he draws on his sfumato, sets her in a natural setting where she seems to miraculously emerge from the darkness. She seems like she's coming out of the earth itself, almost like Venus out of the ocean. And he's using the sfumato to enhance that idea of emerging from the landscape. That then underscore the idea of the immaculate conception of the Virgin Mary. Some details. The surface of this picture is not in the best of shape. Leonardo, because he was so inquisitive, was always sort of questioning traditional techniques. So with his paintings, he would not follow the traditional recipes, right? Would try to do different things. And they end up sort of suffering because he wasn't always right. Right? The traditions were usually better for these things. But there we see the face of this angel. There's this wonderful drawing for this too. I should have brought it in. But you can see how even though this is pixelating a little bit, the wing sort of fades back through the sfumato into that into the weeds behind it, right? How there are no distinct delineations between the shadow of the cheek and where the hair begins. Right? He loves that idea of obscuring things and having them emerge in and out of the shadows. Here's a nice detail of the landscape in the background, where not only do those vertical mountains almost seem as if it's like, remember Star Trek II with Spock, right? And they send him down to the death of Spock, and they send him to this world that's just being recreated. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but there's this, and there's mountains along there that are just jutting up out of the ground, as if it's the world at its very beginning, at its very birth, right? Coming out. And then also coming out of the shadow, right? Emerging in front of us, as if this is like the birth of everything. And he sees the miraculous conception of the Virgin Mary as, and a metaphor for that in this landscape that seems to be emerging directly in front of us. Okay. Here again, more of the sfumato as the arm goes back into the sleeve, as the sleeve sort of melds with the background around us. And by avoiding some of the traditional trappings, Leonardo makes the picture somewhat complicated. So we know it's the Virgin Mary, we know it's Jesus and John the Baptist. Which one's which? Which one's Jesus? Which one's the Baptist? You know the story, right? So John the Baptist is Jesus' cousin, right? And John the Baptist should be about 6 months older. And John the Baptist is the one who eventually recognizes Christ and gives him sort of his first public recognition when he baptizes him in the River Jordan. Behold the Lamb of God, right? So, which of these two is John? Gabrielle, you had your hand up. The one that's kneeling. So the one here. This way. Why do you say that?
Because he was like giving praise to Jesus, and Jesus always
So are you saying that this is Jesus or the other one with the angel is Jesus?
the other one.
Oh, okay. The other one with the angel is Jesus. Does everybody agree? Yeah? Because he's being prayed to versus being blessed. Right? So one is blessing the other and one is being prayed to. It's interesting, isn't it? Because you could look at some evidence and argue the other way. I think I agree. Right? But you'll also notice, which one is the angel pointing at? The other one, right? And in addition to that, remember what blue means for the Virgin Mary? It means royalty, but what else? Faithfulness to his cause, right? And part of that is that she's supposed to protect him. So she's got her hand around the other one as well, wearing this color of protection. It's complex, isn't it? You don't know for sure, and your eye just keeps going back and forth between them. Could he be, is John the Baptist, when he finally sees Jesus, right, is his message to him is one of blessing. Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world, right? So, the one on the left looks older too, right? I think one of the things that Leonardo wants us to do, right, is the same thing with the sfumato, where you've got to kind of figure it out. You can't just like walk up and I get it. Right? He's not going to hit us with a shovel. Right? he's gonna allude to things and make it more difficult. I should remember. There's a second version of this. We don't know why he painted it. There's one that was painted probably 20 years later, and it's in Britain. It's in London. Okay, it's got halos. It's nowhere near as good as this one. We think maybe Alphabet, but it's got symbols as well. I should have brought it in to remind myself which one he said later is it. Right? But the idea that we can't tell, right? The idea that it's complicated is the same way he complicates it with the space, right? The same way he complicates it with the fading into the back. Right? That's a typical Leonardo thing. So again, it's all about your mind, right? He's addressing it not entirely visually, but it's a sort of mental conception that he wants us to understand. Right? There's the other one. The angel's expression is for me sort of the most difficult thing about this. The fact that the angel is pointing to the other one. Right? And the angel announces the birth of Christ. Suggests to me that maybe the other one is meant to be Jesus. But again, I'm happy to entertain both ways around this, right? Well, again, Duke Ludovico Sforza, he's working for Ludovico. He not only does he do this altarpiece for this brotherhood that Ludovico belonged to, but Ludovico also supported a monastery, right? We've seen other artists or other patrons do this. Cosimo de' Medici supported the monastery San Marco, where Fra Angelico lived. And Philip the Bold of Burgundy, right, supported the monastery in Dijon, the monastery of Champmall, right? And the idea, this is quite normal, is you get a prayer group, right? People that will pray for you through your entire life, which is a great thing. And it was a good work that helped to assure your salvation. Well, Sforza supports this monastery in Milan, and of course he deploys Leonardo to decorate it because he's his court artist, right? And this particular painting, the Last Supper, the famous Last Supper, was in the dining hall of the monastery, the refectory of the monastery. And that meant that when the monks ate, they ate with Christ. Because what we see is Christ's last meal with his followers, with his apostles, right? And the members of the monastery get to share that meal. They get to break bread with Christ every meal. The one-point perspective that Leonardo uses, you can see very much makes it look as if Christ is there. It extends our space really credibly. Now, a lot of the monastery has been damaged. Italy in World War II was the enemy. Did you see the Monuments Men movie with Bill Murray and George Clooney? Did you see that a couple years back? Oh, okay. This will be the last thing. In World War II, right, we're fighting against Germany, Italy, Japan as the Axis. But in Europe, it's primarily Germany and Italy. And our government did something rather enlightened. I can't imagine we would do this now. They established a team of art historians to work for the army that were known as the Monuments Men. And their job was to advise the army on monuments they should try to spare if they could. Right? So there were certain things, they're going to go in, they're going to bomb the heck out of Italy and Germany. And if you can avoid hitting this museum, that would be awfully nice. Right? If you can avoid hitting that church, right? Wherever possible you could avoid these things. That was their job through most of the war. And then after the war, they found all the stuff that Hitler had confiscated, right? And they got it back to the museums where it belonged originally, right? That was kind of the job. So there was this advisory group behind the scenes as we're going out and destroying Italy, right? And Milan was one of the major capitals of Mussolini and the fascists, right? It was one of their major capitals. And the Jesus bombed out. And the Monuments Men sent a message to the monastery, right? Undercover, and said, we're coming. And I don't know if we can protect you. Could you do something to protect the Last Supper? and they sandbagged the wall on both sides. Like just built a mountain of sandbags around the Last Supper, and when the bombs fell on the lawn, the rest of it was destroyed. Everything but the Last Supper was destroyed in World War II. And that's why when we look at it, we've only got a little bit. You can see where the wall, what was left of it, right? And so we're very, very fortunate that way, thanks to the monuments, right? The doorway that you see below was cut into it later. Originally, just took up the entire wall, right? So what we have left is a bit of a pale reflection of what was originally there, right? And with that in mind, when we look at Jesus in the middle, so this is the moment when he tells the apostles, one of you is going to betray me. One of you is going to betray me. And they're reacting to this enemy, right? And Leonardo in painting, it's a fresco. Okay, so remember fresco is like you paint with wet plaster. But remember with Giotto, with the blue, how it flecked off because he went over the top of it, right? With dry paint or wet paint on the dry plaster. Leonardo decided that he didn't like the look of fresco. He wanted something brighter and more sort of saturated with color. So he decided to go over the top of the dry plaster with oil paint. And it almost immediately flakes off. So if we look here at Jesus, right? Look at the robe just above the plates. How nice blue that is, right? And how much of it is just flaked away, it's kind of stained instead. It's a ghost of what it originally was. Right? There's very little of the original surface of Leonardo's Last Supper left for us. So as we're looking at this, one of the most famous works of art, really entire history of art, right? We have one in the dining hall. Bad copy of it, right? Go look at that, and we can tell how good Leonardo is, like looking at the bad copies, right? But realize that what we have left is just a sort of a dim vestige of what we're looking at. We'll talk more about this, right? It's 9:15. So we'll talk more about this on Thursday. We'll move on from Leonardo to look at Raphael and Michelangelo. You've got something due on Thursday, so I'm not going to make the next worksheets due this week because I want you working on your bibliography. I don't want those things to crash all together on you, right? So I'll update the due dates for the ones that haven't been assigned a due date yet, but they will not come due this week so that you can focus on your bibliography, okay? Some of you have already emailed them to me, great, and I'll be getting grades back to you on the other ones soon.